A name can be a crown or a chain. For one princess, it was both. Her name was once whispered with reverence in marbled halls, a melody of hope for a kingdom draped in sunlight. But love and loyalty are fragile things, and the brightest crowns often cast the darkest shadows. This is the story of how a name, once a symbol of power, was erased by the very hands that were sworn to protect it, and how a princess learned that the most brutal cage is not made of iron, but of betrayal. In the heart of a sprawling continent, the kingdom of Aethelgard stood as a testament to old glory. Its gleaming spires pierced the clouds, and its sun-drenched courtyards echoed with the sounds of prosperity. Here, Princess Lyra lived a life woven from silk and starlight. She was the jewel of the realm, her laughter a cherished sound, her future a path paved with the adoration of her people. Her father, King Theron, a man whose weary eyes held the weight of his lineage, would often hold her close and speak of duty, of legacy, and of the unshakable bond of their bloodline. He promised her a world of safety within the castle walls, a fortress built not of stone, but of familial love. But even as he spoke these words, shadows were gathering in the corners of the kingdom, whispers of debt and desperation that Lyra was too young, too sheltered to understand. Lyra's world was one of gilded comfort. Her days were a gentle rhythm of lessons in diplomacy, history, and the arts. She learned the dances of the court, the songs of her ancestors, and the intricate languages of the kingdoms that bordered their own. Her tutors praised her quick mind and her gentle spirit, qualities that made her beloved by the common folk who would catch a glimpse of her riding through the city. Her father, King Theron, cherished her, or so it seemed. He called her his morning star, a beacon of purity in a world he knew was filled with compromise and political maneuvering. He gifted her a silver locket engraved with those very words, a promise of his unending protection. She never took it off. Her older brother, Kaelen, was a different soul altogether. Where Lyra was grace, he was ambition. Where she inspired love, he demanded fear. He walked the palace corridors with a restless energy, his eyes lingering on the throne with a hunger that unnerved those who saw it. He viewed his sister's popularity not with pride, but with a simmering jealousy. To him, the people's affection for her was affection stolen from him, the rightful heir. He saw her gentleness as weakness, a liability the kingdom could not afford. He would often mock her studies, telling her that the only language that truly mattered was the language of power, a tongue spoken with steel and gold, not with poetry and kindness. Lyra, ever trusting, dismissed his words as little more than a brother's bitter jest. She could not fathom the depths of the darkness that festered in his heart. The first signs of trouble were subtle, like the scent of rain on a distant wind. Dignitaries from the formidable Valerian Empire began to arrive, their faces stern and their clothing stark against the vibrant tapestries of Aethelgard's court. They met with the king and Kaelen in closed chambers for hours, their voices low and tense. When her father emerged from these meetings, the lines on his face were deeper, the weight in his eyes heavier. He avoided Lyra's questions, offering vague assurances that all was well, that these were simple matters of statecraft too dull for her to worry about. Lyra noticed the royal coffers were emptying, the lavish festivals grew smaller, the guards wore older armor, and a quiet anxiety began to seep into the very stones of the palace. One evening, Lyra overheard a heated argument between her father and brother. Kaelen's voice was sharp, cutting. "We have no other choice. Their offer is the only thing that will save us from ruin. It is a small price to pay for the survival of our name, our legacy." Her father's reply was a broken whisper. "She is your sister, Kaelen. She is my daughter." "She is a princess," Kaelen retorted, his voice as cold as ice. "And a princess's duty is to serve her kingdom. This is her service, a sacrifice, for the greater good.
A cold dread washed over Lyra, but she could not make sense of their words. A sacrifice? What could they possibly mean? She retreated into the safety of her chambers, clutching the silver locket at her throat, the engraved words a comforting lie. Always my morning star. She convinced herself that her family, her blood, would never let any harm come to her. It was a child's faith, pure and unwavering, and it was about to be shattered into a million pieces. A week later, the announcement was made. Lyra was to embark on a ceremonial journey to a distant province, a diplomatic mission to strengthen ties with her own people. It was presented as a great honor, a chance for her to prove her worth as a royal ambassador. A grand celebration was held, and the court buzzed with excitement. Lyra, though nervous, felt a surge of pride. This was her chance to serve, just as Kaelen had said. Her father embraced her at the gates, his hug lingering a moment too long. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He simply pressed a kiss to her forehead and turned away. Kaelen stood beside him, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. It was the last time she would ever see them as family. The journey began as promised, with a royal guard and banners flying. But on the third day, they took a different road, one that led away from the lush farmlands and towards the barren, rocky borderlands. The captain of her guard, a man she had known since childhood, became quiet and evasive. When Lyra questioned their route, he would only say they were following the king's orders. The sense of dread returned, this time stronger, colder. It coiled in her stomach like a serpent. They arrived at a desolate outpost near the Valerian border as the sun bled across the sky. There were no cheering crowds, no provincial nobles to greet her. There was only a small, heavily armed contingent of Valerian soldiers and a single, imposing figure in dark armor. He was the envoy her father had been meeting with. He held a heavy scroll, sealed with the Valerian crest. The captain of her own Aethelgard guard dismounted and, without a word, unlocked the door to her carriage. He did not look at her. His shame was a palpable thing, a foul stench in the air. 2 Valerian guards moved forward, their faces impassive. They reached for her, their gauntlets rough against the fine silk of her dress. Panic seized her. She looked back at her own men, her people, her protectors. They stood silent, their heads bowed, their spears pointed at the ground. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply watched. "What is this?" she cried out, her voice trembling. "Father would never allow this. There has been a mistake." The Valerian envoy unfurled the scroll. He did not address her, but spoke to his guards in a harsh tongue. The captain of the Aethelgard guard then stepped forward, holding a similar document. An exchange was made, Aethelgard's seal for Valerian gold. It was not a kidnapping. It was a transaction. A sale. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her brother's words echoed in her mind. A small price to pay. A sacrifice. For the greater good. Her father's averted eyes. Her brother's cruel smile. This was not a mistake. This was a plan. Her kingdom was drowning in debt, and she was the currency used to pay for its survival. Her own family had sold her. The Valerian guards dragged her from the carriage. She fought, for the first time in her life, with a desperate, primal fury, but she was no match for them. They tore the fine jewelry from her neck and wrists, tossing it aside like trinkets. One of them reached for the silver locket. She clutched it, her one remaining link to a love she now knew was a lie. He grunted, yanking it with such force, the chain snapped, cutting her skin. He pocketed it without a second glance. They bound her hands with coarse rope and threw her into the back of a crude, windowless wagon. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The last thing she saw was the Aethelgard banners turning around, retreating back to the kingdom she once called home, abandoning her without a backward glance. The princess was gone. In her place, there was only cargo. The journey that followed was a descent into a living nightmare. Days blurred into a suffocating cycle of darkness, jolting movements, and stale air. When the doors finally opened, she was not in a Valerian palace, but in a squalid, bustling slave market. The stench of sweat, fear, and despair was overwhelming. She was dragged onto a wooden platform, stripped of her royal attire, and forced into a rough, shapeless tunic. Her name, Lyra, was never spoken again. Instead, a hot iron was pressed against her shoulder, searing a symbol into her flesh. She was property now, marked and numbered.
She was sold to a cruel foreman who oversaw the Valerian salt mines. Life became a monotonous hell of back-breaking labor under a punishing sun. The other slaves were broken people, their eyes hollow, their spirits crushed. They came from a dozen different conquered lands, all of them stripped of their pasts. Here, there were no princesses, no scholars, no merchants. There were only hands to work and backs to break. Lyra learned to survive. She learned to be invisible, to work without complaint, to endure the casual brutality of the overseers. Her soft hands became calloused and scarred. Her once radiant skin was burned by the sun and caked with grime. She grew thin and hard, a shadow of the girl who once danced in sunlit halls. But while her body was enslaved, her mind remained free. At night, in the crowded, filthy barracks, she would close her eyes and retreat into her memories. But they were no longer a comfort. They were a torment. She replayed every conversation with her father, every condescending remark from her brother, searching for the signs she had missed. The betrayal was a fire that burned within her, a cold, constant flame that kept the despair at bay. It was a fuel forged from pure hatred. Hatred for the father who had traded her life for his crown, and for the brother who had orchestrated it all out of sheer, venomous greed. She no longer wept. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she nurtured her anger, letting it harden her heart into a shield. Years passed. She was sold again, this time to the household of a wealthy Valerian general. Her work changed from the mines to the kitchens and servant quarters. It was less physically brutal, but in some ways more agonizing. Here, she was surrounded by the opulence and power that had been stolen from her. She served wine in goblets finer than any she had known, and cleaned floors of polished marble that reminded her of her long-lost home. She moved through this world like a ghost, her face a mask of obedience, her mind a fortress of rebellion. She learned to listen, to watch. She learned the Valerians' language perfectly, catching snippets of conversation about politics, about war, and sometimes about the struggling little kingdom of Aethelgard, which had used its princess to buy a few more years of fragile peace. The climax of her silent suffering arrived on a night she would never forget. The general was hosting a lavish banquet for the military elite. She was one of the slaves tasked with serving the guests. As she moved through the throng of laughing, feasting Valerians, her eyes fell on the general's wife. Adorning the woman's neck, gleaming against her expensive silk gown, was a familiar piece of jewelry. It was a simple silver locket. Time seemed to stop. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She drew closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no mistake. It was hers. The delicate chain, the unique clasp. And as the woman turned, she saw the engraving on the back, the words that had once been her entire world. Always my morning star. The locket had not merely been stolen and sold. It had been part of the deal, a personal token, a final, intimate piece of the transaction. Her father hadn't just sacrificed her, he had sweetened the pot with a symbol of his supposed love. In that instant, any lingering sliver of doubt, any faint hope that her father had been forced into this, that he had grieved for her, turned to ash. It was the ultimate desecration. The king had not only sold his daughter, he had sold the very promise he made to her. The betrayal was absolute, a wound so deep it could never heal. She felt nothing, not rage, not sorrow, just a vast, cold emptiness. The final chain around her heart had just been forged. From that day on, something within her settled. The fire of her rage cooled into something harder, more enduring. Hope for rescue, a foolish, childish dream, died completely. Her past was a ghost story, a tale told of a girl who no longer existed. Lyra of Aethelgard was dead. In her place was only a survivor, a nameless woman with eyes that had seen the very worst of human nature. She continued her duties, a perfect, silent slave, but she never forgot. She carried the memory of the betrayal not as a burden, but as a testament. It was the one thing they could not take from her. It was the core of who she had become. She would live out her days in the heart of the empire that had bought her, a forgotten princess whose sacrifice had been for nothing more than a brief delay of the inevitable. The glittering palace of Aethelgard was a distant dream, a world away. Her reality was now one of servitude, her identity erased, her future a blank slate of endless tomorrows, each one the same as the last. She was the ghost at the feast, a haunting reminder that the most devastating betrayals are not inflicted by enemies, but by the ones you love. For while they had taken her name and her freedom, they could never steal the chilling, crystal-clear memory of the king who sold his own blood. If you enjoyed this untold story, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden History of Human Race for more hidden voices from history.